Welcome back to the deep dive. Um, I want to start today's conversation with a number,
Okay.
or, well, really a specific moment in time, because I honestly think history books are going to look back on this as a definitive before and after line.
It's that significant.
It really is. You know, we usually walk around with this very specific image of the United States in our heads. If you ask anyone, they think of the aircraft carriers,
Right.
the stealth bombers, the bases in, I don't know, 80 different countries. We think of the U.S. as this unstoppable military juggernaut with a budget that just completely dwarfs the next 10 nations combined.
Yeah, it's the classic arsenal of democracy image. It's totally ingrained in our psyche.
Exactly. It's the default setting for how we view global power. And this brings us to the source material we are unpacking today. We have just crossed a very grim, very specific Rubicon that completely shatters that image.
We have.
As of right now, in the United States, the interest expenditures on the national debt have officially exceeded military expenditures.
It is a staggering milestone. I really don't think people truly grasp the gravity of that sentence.
No, they don't.
It effectively means the past has become more expensive than present defense. We are now paying more for the ghosts of money we've already spent.
Right, on bailouts.
Bailouts, stimulus checks, massive bureaucratic expansion. We're paying more just on the interest for that than we are paying for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines combined.
That is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. I mean, we're essentially spending more to service the credit card bill than to actually defend the house.
That is the perfect analogy, and it sets the stage perfectly for the primary voice we are diving into today.
Martin Armstrong.
Yes, we are unpacking a transcript of a very extensive and frankly alarming interview with Martin Armstrong. And for the listeners who might not be familiar with that name, we should probably clarify right off the bat. Armstrong isn't your typical, tweed jacket academic economist who sits in a faculty lounge drawing supply and demand curves.
No, not at all. Reading his background, he seems like a character out of a financial thriller novel.
That's a great way to put it. Armstrong is a trader.
Yeah.
He's a former hedge fund manager. He's the guy who builds these massive, intricate computer models to forecast capital flows globally.
He actually explicitly says in this interview that he deals with reality rather than theory.
Exactly. He doesn't care what the textbooks say should happen. He cares about what the money is actually doing in real time.
Right. And he mentions his resume in the source text, and it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
He talks about being called in to advise the Chinese government, specifically during the Asian currency crisis back in 97.
Mm-hmm.
He was advising the European authorities in 98, right before the euro launched. So he's been in the room where it happens.
He has. And because he comes from that high-stakes trading background, his perspective is brutal. It's completely unsentimental. It's not about political ideology. It's strictly about math. And his forecast in this discussion, it's intense.
Intense is putting it mildly. I mean, he's talking about the absolute inevitability of a sovereign debt crisis, the potential breakup of the European Union, the collapse of Republican forms of government. And to be clear, he means the system of a republic, not the American political party.
Right, the actual structure of representation.
Exactly. And why war is currently being used as a deliberate distraction from domestic economic failure.
It sounds incredibly apocalyptic.
It does.
Yeah.
But he also argues, and this is the key that really kept me reading, that this is a cycle. He claims there's actually a light at the end of the tunnel, provided we understand the crash that's coming.
Okay.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this grim but fascinating forecast. We're going to look at the debt, the push for war, the politics, and finally, the solution he proposes.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's start with what Armstrong calls the core rot, the sovereign debt crisis. He makes this point early on, that governments have been borrowing since World War II with absolutely zero intention of paying it back.
That is the dirty little secret of modern finance. And we really need to pause on this for a second, because if you or I take out a mortgage or a car loan, there is an amortization schedule. The bank expects that in 30 years, the balance is zero. You pay the principal and the interest.
You actually pay it off.
You pay it off. But for governments, the strategy has always been to simply issue new debt to pay off the old debt. It's a perpetual rollover machine.
It's a Ponzi scheme.
By strict definition, yes. If a private company did this, if they paid off old investors with money from new investors without generating any actual profit to cover it, the executives would go to federal prison.
Yeah, that's literally what Bernie Madoff did.
Exactly. But when the government does it, it's just called fiscal policy.
Yeah.
But Armstrong points out the mathematical inevitability here. He uses a great image. He says a 3-year-old with a pocket calculator can figure out that this isn't sustainable.
Because of the compound interest.
Exactly. It's not complex calculus. It's simple arithmetic. You can roll the debt over for a long time, especially when interest rates are kept artificially low.
Right, which they were for a decade.
Right. But eventually, the pile of debt gets so massive that the interest payments alone consume the entire budget. And that is exactly where we are now. When the interest eats the budget, you can't fund the military, you can't fund social programs, you can't fix the bridges.
And that's the tipping point.
That is the tipping point where the social contract breaks and you get civil unrest. Armstrong is arguing we are standing right on that precipice today.
Now, he talks a lot about the U.S., but he focuses very heavily on Europe as the sort of epicenter of this upcoming earthquake. He tells this amazing story about meeting with European officials back in 1998, right before the euro was officially launched. And he gave them a stark warning.
He did. He told them they were trying to build a unified currency to compete with the U.S. dollar, but they were missing the single most important ingredient. He told them flat out, you cannot have a common currency without consolidating the debt.
He brings up Alexander Hamilton here, right? Which I thought was a brilliant historical pivot.
It is, and it makes it so clear. Think about the founding of the United States. After the Revolutionary War, the individual states, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, they were financial disasters.
They were broke.
Completely broke, drowning in war debt. They were essentially bankrupt separate countries. Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Treasury Secretary, realized that for the United States to be a real cohesive entity and for the new dollar to have any global credibility,
the federal government had to assume all those individual debts.
Right. He rolled them all into one big pot. He unified the financial backing. That's what created the full faith and credit of the United States.
Okay, so Armstrong basically told the Europeans they had to do the exact same thing.
Yes. He said, if you want a United States of Europe, you need a unified European bond. You need to merge the credit cards, so to speak.
But they didn't do it.
No, they didn't. And the reason is fascinatingly political. Armstrong points directly to Helmut Kohl, who was the German chancellor at the time. Kohl was the primary driving force behind the euro. He essentially forced Germany into it unilaterally.
Right. Armstrong mentions that Kohl later admitted to acting, quote-unquote, like a dictator on this issue.
That's a direct quote attributed to him. Kohl apparently admitted that if he had let the German people actually vote on adopting the euro, he would have lost 7-3.
Wow.
It would have been a landslide rejection.
Why were the Germans so against it, though? I mean, on paper, a unified, peaceful Europe sounds like a great idea.
Because the Germans can do math.
Right.
They knew they were the strongest, most productive economy in the bloc. They knew that if they merged their strong currency with structurally weaker economies like Greece or Italy or Spain without strict fiscal safeguards, they would end up being the permanent piggy bank.
They'd just be bailing everyone else out forever.
Exactly. So Kohl just pushed it through without a democratic vote because he believed the political symbol of a united Europe was more important than the underlying economic reality.
And Armstrong says this created a massive facade.
Right. Because to a trader like Armstrong, the creation of the euro didn't change the underlying reality of the debt. He says when he's sitting at his trading desk staring at his screens, he still has to make a fundamental choice. He has to decide, do I want to buy German debt or do I want to buy Italian debt?
Because they are absolutely not the same asset.
Not at all. There is no European bond in the same way there is a U.S. Treasury bond.
So when the economic pressure hits, the cracks show up immediately.
Exactly. When the global system is stressed, investors flee the risky Italian debt, and they run to the safety of the German debt. And that massive capital flight is what breaks the currency peg. And that fragmentation is what makes Europe so incredibly vulnerable to what Armstrong calls the capital cannon.
Oh, I love this metaphor. Or, well, actually, I was deeply terrified by it.
It's a very powerful, very vivid image. He actually pulls this from Herbert Hoover's memoirs from 1931. Hoover described global capital as a loose cannon on the deck of a ship in the middle of a hurricane.
Just picture that for a second. A massive multi-ton iron cannon just rolling freely around the deck, smashing into the mast, crushing the railings, just completely out of control, firing in every direction.
It's destructive, it's immensely heavy, and it's completely uncontrollable. And Armstrong applies this directly to modern global markets. He says money moves exponentially faster than politicians can ever hope to react.
He gives a specific example of Greece in 2010. during their debt crisis.
Right. So while the politicians in Brussels were forming oversight committees and scheduling emergency meetings for next Tuesday to discuss a potential bailout framework, what were the actual traders doing?
They were just hammering the sell button.
They were shorting Greece into oblivion. They made an absolute fortune as the Greek bond market crashed. And this highlights the predatory efficiency of the global market, the trading room literally shouted, "Who's next?"
It sounds like a pack of wolves looking for the limping deer in the herd.
That is exactly what it is. They looked
Yeah.
at the map, they looked at the debt to GDP ratios of the other countries, and they said, okay, Spain looks weak, Italy looks shaky, and the capital cannon immediately swivels and aims at the next victim.
Wow.
Armstrong's point is that governments simply cannot form committees fast enough to track where this money is going. By the time they finally have a meeting to discuss implementing new regulations, the market has already destroyed their bond market and moved on.
So we have this massive structural weakness built into Europe and a massive debt bomb ticking in the U.S. But this raises a huge question. Why aren't the experts fixing this? I mean, we have Ivy League economists running the Federal Reserve, running the European Central Bank. They all have PhDs. Why does Armstrong seem to have so much utter disdain for modern economic theory?
Rubbish. I think that was the exact word he used. Absolute rubbish.
Yeah, he definitely did not mince words there.
His main gripe is that modern economics is still completely obsessed with Keynesianism, but they've completely bastardized the original idea.
How so? Because, we hear about Keynes all the time in the news. Stimulus packages, deficit spending. It's basically the standard government playbook at this point.
Well, you have to look at what John Maynard Keynes originally suggested. He argued that government should run deficits specifically during a depression to stimulate demand.
Right.
It was supposed to be emergency medicine. It was like using a defibrillator on a heart attack victim. You shock the heart to get it beating again. But Armstrong argues that modern politicians took that emergency measure and started treating it like a daily vitamin or lifestyle choice.
So instead of saving money when the economy is actually doing well, they just keep spending it.
Exactly. They run massive deficits when the economy is booming, and they run massive deficits when it's crashing. They just love spending money they don't have because, frankly, it buys votes. They completely threw away the second half of Keynes' theory that explicitly said, when times are good, you pay down the debt you took on during the bad times.
They never pay it down, ever.
Never. And he also mentions a crucial technical point. He says that these theories are all based on the 1930s, when national economies were largely closed systems.
That felt like a really important distinction.
It's the difference between a small pond and the open ocean. In 1930, if the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates, it mostly just affected Americans. We didn't have global instantaneous electronic trading. We didn't have massive foreign ownership of U.S. government debt. It was a closed loop. If you turned a dial in Washington, the effect happened in Chicago. Today, capital is entirely global. It flows like water to wherever the yield is highest or the perceived safety is best. And this leads directly to what he calls the shell game of the money supply. Now, this is where we need to get a bit technical because this is the hidden engine of inflation that almost nobody talks about on the news.
He talks about how debt literally is money now. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah.
Because that sounds counterintuitive.
Sure. This is a massive structural shift that happened after the Bretton Woods system collapsed in the 1970s. So think back to the 1950s or 60s. If you bought a government savings bond, you couldn't use that bond as collateral for anything else. It was illegal.
Right.
So if you took your cash and bought a bond, that cash was effectively taken out of the active economy. It was frozen for the duration of the bond.
So it acted almost like a forced savings account.
Yeah.
It reduced the actual money supply circulating in the wild.
Yeah. Correct. It was intrinsically anti-inflationary. But today, if you hold a treasury bill, you can post it as collateral to trade futures on the stock market.
Right.
You can take it to a major bank and borrow cash against it. This is what's known as the repo market.
Right.
So the debt itself circulates and functions just like cash.
Let me make sure I'm getting this. So issuing government debt doesn't remove money from the system anymore like it used to. It actually adds to the overall liquidity.
Precisely. It is inflationary by its very nature now. The government prints a bond, someone buys it, and then they immediately borrow against it to buy stocks or real estate. The money essentially multiplies. And because central banks don't accurately account for this massive global flow and the shadow money, their traditional interventions just fail.
And Armstrong gives a really great example of this failing in practice, talking about quantitative easing, QE.
Yes. The China trade. This is a perfect textbook example of unintended consequences. So the Federal Reserve wanted to lower long-term interest rates to help stimulate the U.S. housing market.
Right, cheaper mortgages.
Exactly. So they announced they were going to buy up massive amounts of 30-year U.S. Treasury bonds. Now, the traditional textbook theory says if the Fed buys bonds, the supply goes down, the price of the bonds goes up, and therefore the interest rate goes down.
Sounds perfectly logical. Basic supply and demand.
In a closed room, yes. But the Fed assumed they were buying those 30-year bonds from Americans who would then take that newly injected cash and put it into a mortgage or a new business right here in the USA. But Armstrong points out that China saw this massive buyer enter the market and said, oh, you want to pay top dollar for 30-year bonds? Sold.
They saw a perfect opportunity to offload their long-term debt.
Exactly. China sold their long-term U.S. debt directly to the Fed at a premium, took the cash, and immediately moved it into shorter-term 5-year bonds, or they moved it out of the dollar entirely to buy gold or other global assets.
So the newly printed money didn't stay in the U.S. housing market at all. It just left the building.
It left the country completely. The Fed is playing a localized domestic game in a highly complex global stadium. They're turning dials on a machine that simply isn't connected the way they think it is anymore.
Wow. Okay, so this brings us to what is arguably the most disturbing part of the conversation. If the economic theories are totally failing and the debt is mathematically unpayable, as he says, what do governments actually do? Armstrong says they don't just come out and say, whoops, our bad, we ruined the economy.
No, governments never, ever admit failure on that scale. They look for a distraction. And Armstrong's maxim on this is terrifyingly simple. He says when a government faces massive domestic civil opposition due to its own economic failure, it always looks for an external enemy.
War as the ultimate distraction.
War as a unification tool. It's literally the oldest trick in the political playbook. If your people are furious about hyperinflation or systemic corruption or failing public services, you urgently need to redirect that anger away from yourself. You need to point a finger at a foreigner and say, no, it's his fault. He points to Iran in 1979 as a classic historical case study of this.
The hostage crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
The Ayatollah had just taken power, and he was facing massive internal opposition. There were rival factions actively trying to overthrow him. The revolution was incredibly shaky, so what did he do? He seized the American embassy and took dozens of hostages, and suddenly the entire national narrative shifted overnight.
It wasn't about the Ayatollah's failing domestic policies anymore. It was entirely about fighting the great Satan.
Exactly. It silenced the internal dissent instantly. If you criticized the regime after that, you weren't just a political opponent with a valid economic grievance. You were a traitor. You were siding with America. It completely consolidated his power.
And Armstrong sees this exact same playbook happening in Europe right now, specifically regarding Russia.
He does. He forcefully argues that European leaders are using Putin as the ultimate economic scapegoat. The European economy is crumbling, energy prices are absolutely skyrocketing, major industrial plants are shutting down in Germany because they cut themselves off from cheap Russian gas. But if a citizen or a politician complains about this economic suicide, they immediately get labeled a Putin puppet.
It just completely shuts down the debate.
It makes terrible economic mismanagement a matter of national security. The narrative becomes, we all have to suffer high prices and job losses for the war effort. It's an incredibly convenient narrative for politicians who have spent decades wrecking their own economies.
But he goes even further than just scapegoating. And this part really shocked me. He suggests there is a genuine, deep-seated delusion among current European leaders that they can actually conquer Russia. And the financial motivation he implies is wild.
Yes, this is where his background and his high-level sources come into play. He mentions speaking to very highly placed contacts in Europe, and he says the current crop of European leaders is the quote-unquote worst he has ever seen in his entire career.
Wow.
He says they've somehow convinced themselves their own propaganda, that Russia is weak, that Putin will just crumble under pressure, and that they can somehow militarily defeat a nuclear power and seize Russia's assets.
He throws out a massive number for those assets. $75 trillion.
That's the estimated total value of Russia's untapped natural resources. Gold, diamonds, oil, natural gas, platinum, timber, rare earth minerals. Armstrong suggests there is this underlying fantasy in Brussels that if they can just topple the Russian regime, they can seize that immense wealth and use it to miraculously recapitalize the bankrupt European system.
It's like viewing a sovereign nation as a giant loot box.
Effectively, yes. They want to resurrect their failing socialist economies by looting the neighbor. It sounds almost medieval, doesn't it? Like a Viking raiding party looking for silver to pay off their debts.
It sounds like an incredibly desperate gamble.
It is desperate. He specifically calls out French President Emmanuel Macron on this. He says his high-ranking contacts in France actually referred to Macron behind closed doors as Petit Napoleon.
Ouch. I mean, that's not exactly a compliment in French politics.
No, it's a warning about his ego. He mentions Macron stripping rank from seasoned French generals who dared to disagree with his military assessments. Armstrong portrays these leaders as dangerously isolated from reality, genuinely thinking they can fight a conventional ground war against the largest nuclear power on Earth.
He even notes that the head of NATO had to come out publicly and warn Europe.
Right. Jens Stoltenberg basically had to say, if you think you can conquer Russia without the United States doing the heavy lifting, you are totally delusional.
Which really implies that even the top NATO military leadership sees some of this going rogue mentality brewing in European capitals. It suggests a really dangerous fracturing of the alliance's core strategies.
It does. It strongly suggests the political leadership in Europe is becoming completely unmoored from military reality simply because their domestic economic reality is so dire. They are desperately looking for a miracle cure, and to them, war looks like that cure.
This naturally leads us to the broader political structure that allows this to happen. Armstrong isn't just criticizing specific leaders like Macron or Kohl. He's criticizing the entire systemic model of Republican government. And he's very careful to distinguish between a republic and a democracy.
Yes.
We tend to use those terms interchangeably in casual conversation, but he says historically they are very different animals.
This is a vital history lesson he provides. He starts by saying no empire lasts forever, or else we'd all still be speaking Babylonian.
Right.
But he argues that republics, which are systems where you elect representatives to vote on your behalf, are historically the worst possible form of government for long-term survival.
Why is that? Because I think most of us were taught that the republic was the gold standard of governance.
Well, because they're uniquely and inherently prone to bribery and corruption. Think about it. In a republic, you elect one representative to speak for you and thousands of others. And once that single person is in power, they become a legislative bottleneck. They become a highly efficient target for special interests who want to buy that specific vote. It's infinitely cheaper and easier for a corporation to buy one senator than it is to try and bribe 1 million individual voters.
So its structural corruption is built right into the design of the system.
Exactly. And Armstrong shares a really revealing, specific story about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump to illustrate exactly how this machinery operates behind the scenes.
This was the Vaccine Commission story, right?
Yes. Armstrong recounts personally advising RFK Jr. He told him flat out, the Democrats will never let you run in their primary. But the backstory he gives is that back in 2016, right after the election, but before the Trump presidency really kicked into gear, Trump actually met with RFK Jr. to form a special commission to investigate vaccine safety.
I vaguely remember hearing rumors about that at the time, but nothing ever actually materialized.
Well, according to Armstrong, the pharmaceutical industry immediately mobilized and threatened Congress. They bypassed Trump and went straight to the legislative leadership, specifically the Republicans, Trump's own party.
Wow.
And they said, if you let this oversight commission happen, we are immediately pulling all of our lobbying funding from all of your upcoming re-election campaigns.
So it wasn't a debate on the medical science. It was a direct threat to the politicians' wallets.
Exactly. And just like that, the commission was completely dead on arrival. And keep in mind, this was years before COVID, before any of the massive recent polarization around that topic. Armstrong uses this specific anecdote to powerfully illustrate that it almost doesn't matter who the president is. The actual machinery of the republic runs entirely on lobbying money. The representatives represent the mega donors, not the voters who cast the ballots.
He really challenges the fundamental idea that we live in a functioning democracy at all. He uses the Vietnam War as his ultimate proof of this, which I think hits really hard for anyone who remembers that era or has studied that history.
Yeah. It's a devastating argument. He says, look at the reality of Vietnam. You could be drafted by the government at age 18, handed an M16 rifle, and sent across the world to die in the jungle.
Right.
But under the law at the time, you couldn't legally vote until you were 21. You couldn't even buy a beer.
So you had the ultimate duty to die for the state, but absolutely zero right to choose the politicians sending you there.
Exactly. He asks a really profound question. When are we, the actual citizens, ever asked? Do they ever put it on a ballot and ask us, should we go to war in Iraq? Or should we spend trillions to bail out the big banks in 2008?
No, never.
No. Those massive, life-altering decisions are always made by backroom bureaucrats and career politicians. That, by strict definition, is not a democracy. It's a managed state.
And he firmly believes this managed system is currently reaching its breaking point. He actually predicts a massive balkanization of the West.
Fragmentation. Just like we watched the Soviet Union break apart into independent states in the 90s, he sees the EU and potentially even North American nations fracturing along deep ethnic or economic fault lines.
He goes really deep on the European culture clash. He said the European Union completely failed to become a melting pot the way the United States did.
And he pinpoints language as the absolute primary barrier. This is something Americans often completely overlook when looking at Europe.
Yeah.
In America, you historically had terrible discrimination against new immigrants, sure. But by the second generation, the kids all spoke English. They all went to the same public schools. They watched the same TV shows. An Italian-American marries an Irish-American, and suddenly those ancient European ethnic feuds just disappear. They are just Americans.
But over in Europe,
A Scot from Glasgow generally doesn't marry a Sicilian from Palermo. The geographic and language barriers keep the distinct cultural identities, and more importantly, the historical grievances, very much alive. He mentions the powerful image of Greek citizens protesting Angela Merkel during the height of the sovereign debt crisis by dressing up in Nazi uniforms.
yeah, that was a truly shocking image to see on the news.
But it perfectly illustrates that those deep, visceral memories of World War II are still incredibly raw. You can't just legislate a United States of Europe from a bureaucratic office in Brussels and expect it to overwrite thousands of years of separate history and blood feuds. Armstrong actually cites Otto von Bismarck, the man who unified Germany in the 19th century, who prophesied that the next major world war would originate from some damn foolish thing in the Balkans.
And he was exactly right about World War I.
He was, and Armstrong thinks those same deep historical fault lines are opening up wide again right now.
He also uniquely applies this fragmentation logic to Canada, which I found totally fascinating because we rarely think of Canada breaking apart. But he describes this massive structural split between the East and the West.
It's the exact same one interest rate problem we discussed with the euro. He describes Western Canada, specifically provinces like Alberta, as being very similar to Texas. It's a hard asset, commodity-based economy. Oil, natural gas, cattle, agriculture.
Okay.
While Eastern Canada, places like Toronto and Ottawa, is much more like New York or Washington, it's heavily financial, bureaucratic, and service-based.
And those two types of economies run on completely different business cycles.
Completely opposite cycles. When global oil prices are high, Alberta is absolutely booming. But Toronto might be actively struggling with high inflation because the cost of gas and transport is so expensive.
Right.
Conversely, when oil crashes, Alberta hurts terribly, but Toronto loves the cheap energy overhead. The fundamental structural problem is that the Central Bank of Canada has to set one single interest rate for both these wildly different economies.
So if Toronto was experiencing a massive speculative housing bubble, the central bank decides to raise interest rates to tool it down.
And that very same rate hike instantly bankrupts the farmers and the miners out in Alberta who desperately need access to cheap credit just to operate their heavy machinery and run their farms. Armstrong argues this constant economic friction is slowly tearing Canada apart.
He mentions the net zero policies too.
Yes. He points out how politicians sitting in the Capitol, he mentions Mark Carney, are pushing these aggressive net zero climate policies. They are essentially telling Alberta to just shut down its primary oil industry and, quote, go watch TV, completely ignoring the reality that Alberta is the massive productive economic engine actually funding the country.
It's like the Hunger Games of monetary policy. One region inevitably wins at the direct expense of the other.
And the craziest part is he points out that the United States currently has the exact same structural problem. The Federal Reserve was originally designed with 12 independent regional branches specifically to handle this issue. If the St. Louis Fed realized the Midwest needed cheap money for the agricultural harvest, they could theoretically have a different regional rate than the New York Fed dealing with Wall Street.
Wait, really? I actually didn't know that. They used to have the ability to set different regional rates.
That was the entire original design of the Federal Reserve Act, regional economic autonomy. But Franklin D. Roosevelt completely centralized it all during the Depression in 1935. So now, We have a rigid, one-size-fits-all national rate that causes the exact same regional friction here as it does in Canada and the EU.
This brings us to a really core philosophical point Armstrong makes about what actually generates national wealth. He says it's absolutely not natural resources, it's productivity.
Right. He contrasts Russia and Japan to prove this. Russia has literally everything. Endless land, gold, oil, diamonds, timber, yet their civilian economy constantly struggles.
Right.
Meanwhile, Japan has virtually zero natural resources. It's essentially a volcanic rock in the ocean. Yet post-World War II, they became an absolute global economic superpower. Why? Because of the intense productivity of the people, the underlying culture of hard work, engineering, and innovation.
And he argues that heavy government regulation and attempts at social engineering are the mortal enemies of that productivity. He lays out this concept he calls the tree lemma.
This is a crucial economic concept to grasp. He says society has three desirable goals: social justice, individual liberty, and economic efficiency.
Okay.
But the trilemma states you can only ever pick two. You physically cannot have all three simultaneously.
Can we break that down a bit?
Yeah.
Because social justice is a term that can mean a whole lot of different things depending on who you ask.
Fair point. In this specific economic context, he means strict equality of outcome. Let's walk through his brain surgeon example because it makes it very clear.
Yeah, that was a good one.
If a government decides it wants absolute social justice defined here as everyone in society earning the exact same wage regardless of their job, you have to force the highly trained brain surgeon to earn the exact same hourly wage as the guy sweeping the hospital floor.
Okay, I follow.
But in order to enforce that, the government has to completely violate individual liberty because you are violently dictating wages. You are legally telling the surgeon he is not allowed to charge more for his highly specialized skills.
Right.
And by doing that, you instantly destroy economic efficiency. Because human nature dictates, why would anyone sacrifice 12 years of their life to grueling medical school, take on massive debt, and accept the unbelievable daily stress of literal life and death brain surgery if they get paid the exact same as a sweeper?
They wouldn't?
Exactly.
Yeah.
No one becomes a surgeon, the medical system collapses, and people die. The entire system breaks down.
He compares this direct suppression of productivity to the eventual fall of communism, specifically contrasting how Russia and China handled their transitions. And he's actually visited both countries during these pivotal transition periods.
Yes, and this was one of the most striking sociological anecdotes in the whole interview. He talks about the profound difference in how the two regimes handled the basic family unit. In Stalinist Russia, the state demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty above all else. They systematically taught young children to spy on and report their own parents to the secret police.
He told that incredibly dark story about his friend in East Germany, the Stasi.
Yes. He had a friend who lived in East Germany. When the Berlin Wall finally fell, his friend went down to the archives to get his official Stasi file, the secret police surveillance record they kept on everyone.
Right.
He read the file, came home, and literally started punching holes in the walls of his own house, physically ripping out hidden microphones. Because reading the file made him realize that the people he thought were his absolute closest friends had been secretly reporting on his every move for years.
That is just horrifying.
It completely destroyed all basic social trust. It destroyed the family unit. Armstrong argues that you simply cannot build a functional, productive economy when literally nobody trusts anybody else in the society.
And he says China was fundamentally different in this regard.
Yes. Armstrong says China operated on what he calls the tall poppy syndrome. Politically, you absolutely could not stand out. If you were the tall poppy that grew higher than the rest, the Communist Party cut your head off.
Keep your head down, basically.
Exactly. But inside the home, behind closed doors, they largely didn't destroy the family unit in the same systemic way. They didn't demand children rat out their parents to nearly the same fanatical extent as Stalin did in Russia. Armstrong argues this cultural preservation of the core family unit is exactly why China was able to boom economically so much faster than Russia once they finally opened their markets. The basic trusting unit of society was still intact and ready to work.
But looking at the West today, he sees us slowly moving toward that over-regulated Soviet-style model. He tells a great story about the decline of Detroit to illustrate this.
He says Detroit didn't die simply because of cheap foreign auto competition initially. It died long before that because local politicians got incredibly greedy. Detroit was the Silicon Valley of its day, the richest city.
Right.
But the politicians treated the thriving auto industry like an endless golden goose they could just tax and regulate to death to fund their pet projects. The industry eventually buckled, and Detroit actually defaulted on its municipal debt way back in 1937. It's a very long, predictable cycle of decline caused by the government constantly attacking the productive class.
And he has a hilarious but also kind of depressing personal story about this predatory regulation, the terrorist insurance story.
I actually laughed out loud reading this part, but it's ultimately tragic. He was trying to organize an economic conference in Philadelphia. The city government told him that in order to hold the event, he legally had to buy terrorist insurance to cover the convention center, the city, and the state.
Terrorist insurance for an economics conference.
Right. And the kicker is, it didn't even exist. He called his massive corporate insurance broker, and nobody had ever even heard of such a policy. It was essentially a localized shakedown.
Unbelievable.
Some local politician's brother-in-law probably set up a shell company offering this fake insurance, and if you wanted to do any business in Philly, you just had to pay the toll. Armstrong uses this to show how excessive regulation eventually just becomes a legalized mechanism for theft, not safety.
And his advice to Margaret Thatcher touched on this exact same bureaucratic burden, too.
Right. He was advising Thatcher, and he explained that major global companies were choosing to build factories in Britain over Germany, not just because of baseline wages, but because the insane labyrinth of German labor regulations effectively added an invisible 40% to the base cost of employment. It's the hidden tax of endless bureaucracy.
So if we look at the board right now, we have unpayable sovereign debt, the push for distraction wars, systemic political corruption, and strangling economic regulation. It was a pretty incredibly dark picture, but we promised the listeners the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
Let's talk about the future he envisions. Where is this all ultimately going?
Well, on the purely financial side, he points heavily to gold, but importantly, not for the usual reasons the hardcore gold bugs always cite. He says it's not just an inflation hedge anymore, it's entirely about neutrality.
Explain that concept of neutrality.
Think about the recent financial sanctions placed on Russia. When the U.S. and Europe essentially froze Russia's sovereign assets, they seized their foreign currency reserves held in Western banks. It sent an absolute shockwave through the entire non-Western world.
Right.
Every other country, especially massive players like China and Saudi Arabia, looked at that unprecedented move and said, wait a minute, if we ever disagree with Washington on anything, they can just press a button and take our money.
It completely weaponized the U.S. dollar.
Exactly. It overnight turned the dollar from a neutral, safe reserve asset into a loaded political weapon. So global central banks immediately started buying up physical gold at record aggressive paces. Why? Because gold is intrinsically neutral. It has zero counterparty risk.
Because if you hold U.S. debt, you need the U.S. government to actually pay you back.
Right. You are inherently trusting the U.S. government to honor the contract. If you hold physical gold in your own vault, you don't need anyone's permission to use it. It's yours. The laws of physics dictate its value, not a politician in Washington.
And Armstrong actually predicts gold could hit $8,000 to $10,000 an ounce by the year 2032 as this massive sovereign debt bubble finally bursts.
Right. And he believes the global debt markets will essentially collapse overnight if there is a major hot war.
Because if we go to war with, say, Russia or China, the financial debt relationship immediately ends. We certainly aren't going to keep paying interest on treasury bonds to an active enemy, and they certainly aren't going to continue buying our new bonds. The entire complex web of global finance just dissolves. The capital cannon literally runs out of ammo.
But out of this massive crash, this 2032 horizon he constantly mentions, he actually sees a real chance for a better system.
This is the optimistic turn in his forecast. He argues that historically speaking, governments are never willingly reformed from the inside. They are only ever redesigned after a massive systemic crash or a violent revolution.
Right.
You don't get the U.S. Constitution without fighting the Revolutionary War first. You don't get the French Republic without the chaos of the guillotine. So the coming crash is basically the necessary forest fire to clear out all the deadwood.
Precisely. And his ultimate hope is that the next system we build out of the ashes will be a massive move toward direct democracy.
Like the Swiss model he talks about.
Yes, Switzerland is his prime example. In Switzerland, the citizens can easily trigger a binding national referendum. They vote directly on the major issues themselves. Should we raise national taxes? Should we join this foreign military alliance?
So it's not left up to a so-called representative who can just be bribed by Pfizer or Lockheed Martin behind closed doors.
Exactly. Armstrong mentions a really fascinating recent example where the Swiss people actually voted against taxing their own billionaires at a drastically higher rate.
Which totally shocks most people when they hear it. Why would the middle class vote to protect billionaires' money?
Because the average Swiss voter is economically educated enough to understand that if they tax them too punitively, the billionaires would simply pack up and leave the canton.
And take all their businesses with them.
Right. And then the entire heavy tax burden would fall squarely back onto the middle class. They made a highly pragmatic, long-term economic decision that a career politician who is always just looking for a cheap, populist soundbite to win the next election never would have made.
So the ultimate hope here is that modern technology, combined with this unavoidable impending crisis, will finally force us to end the era of the professional career politician entirely.
That's the grand vision, a system where we are actually asked, where we have a direct say in our fate. He firmly believes humanity will survive this bottleneck, but the current bloated structures, the EU bureaucracy, the centralized managed republics, they're basically dinosaurs standing around watching the meteor come down.
Wow. It's a lot to process. I mean, we've gone from complex interest rate swaps to East German Stasi files to physical gold bars and vaults.
But it perfectly connects the dots in a way you very rarely see on the nightly news. It treats geopolitics, economics, and history as a single, deeply connected ecosystem.
So pulling it all together, what does this actually mean for us, the listeners, right now today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to aggressively stop looking at these daily headlines. The war in Ukraine, the sticky inflation, the constant debt ceiling fights in Congress as separate, isolated events.
Right.
They are all just different symptoms of the exact same underlying disease. A global debt-based system that has finally reached its mathematical limit and is violently thrashing around trying to survive its own collapse.
And like that 3-year-old with the pocket calculator, we just need to look at the cold mathematical reality, not the political rhetoric.
Exactly. Don't listen to what the politicians say on TV. Watch exactly where the smart money is actually going.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, somewhat provocative thought to mull over. Something that really stuck with me from Armstrong's comparison of Stalin and the tall poppy syndrome in China.
The systemic destruction of the family unit.
Right. Armstrong warned that Stalin deliberately destroyed the family unit to ensure that the state became the one and only authority in a citizen's life. And today, in the modern West, we see parents increasingly losing rights over their children's education. We see systemic economic policies and inflation that make it virtually impossible for young families to survive on a single income anymore.
Yeah.
We see an overarching culture that increasingly penalizes the tall poppies, the highly successful and productive, under this vague guise of equity.
It raises a deeply chilling question about our trajectory.
It really does. If the West is slowly drifting toward a system where the state effectively replaces the family as the core foundational unit of society, are we inadvertently repeating the exact same fatal mistake that ultimately hollowed out the Soviet Union from the inside, not just economically, but spiritually?
Well, as they say, history doesn't always repeat, but it certainly rhymes.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.